Michael was about 27 years old when he came to work in a small provincial town in America. He had to visit all the pharmacies during the day and offer them his company's products. At first glance, the town itself seemed gloomy and sleepy. The rainy autumn weather added to the atmosphere. In the central square stood an old brick town hall with a clock on top of a tall bell tower that seemed to reign over the surrounding wooden buildings. Around it were small shops and cozy family cafes, whose signs looked as if they hadn't been changed in the last 50 years. There were hardly any cars on the quiet streets, except for the occasional old pickup truck. There weren't many people either. Time in this town seemed to have stopped somewhere in the last century. The only place to stop in the area was a shabby motel on the outskirts called the Sunrise. The two-story wooden building looked dilapidated, the sun-bleached paint peeling off the facade to reveal gray boards. An old, cracked sign with the establishment's name hung near the entrance. Several windows on the second floor were boarded up with plywood. Michael didn't care. He didn't plan on staying in the city for more than a day. Once inside, he saw a gloomy lobby with broken tiles on the floor and dim, flickering lights under the ceiling. An older, bespectacled man dozed behind the receptionist's desk. After waking him and paying cash for a night's stay, he was given an old, rusty key to room number 9 and began climbing the creaky wooden stairs to the second floor. Finding the right door, the man used the key and entered. The room immediately smelled of damp and mold. There was only a bed, a nightstand, and a closet. In the corner of the ceiling above the closet was a faded picture of the motel when it first opened about 50 years ago. Michael set the bags on the floor and lay down on the creaky bed, planning to fall asleep as soon as possible so he could leave this god-forsaken place in the morning. He tried to sleep, but the insomnia plagued him. Michael tossed and turned on the hard mattress, irritated that it creaked with every movement. In the dim light of the nightlight, he could see the shadows of cracks in the ceiling. The heating pipes behind the wall hummed, making an ominous buzzing sound. It seemed the whole old motel was filled with strange noises, the creaking of floorboards under someone's footsteps, the human-like howling, the slamming of doors and drafts. Michael glanced nervously around his room, with its shabby walls, dusty carpet, and crumbling bedside table. The bedside lamp barely illuminated the room, casting ominous shadows. Outside the window, the trees rustled in the breeze. It seemed to Michael that someone was watching him in the dark. Sometime around midnight, a woman's heartbreaking scream came from an adjoining room behind the wall. Opening his eyes abruptly, Michael jumped up onto the bed. His heart pounded with fear. He lay there for another 5 minutes before curiosity took over. He cautiously stepped out of the room and began to listen. Outside the door of number 8, there was dead silence. Michael tiptoed to the door, cursing the creaking floorboards, waited a few seconds and knocked. There was no answer. The door rattled lazily in the draft. Michael returned to his room at a loss and sat on his bed until morning. All the sounds of the motel at night seemed ominous to him. The creaking of the bed, the rustling behind the wall, the footsteps in the hallway. At first light, he hurried to the desk clerk to tell him what had happened during the night. He looked at him somberly and said reluctantly, "Number 8 has been empty since a young girl, Emily, was brutally murdered there 20 years ago. Her body was found dismembered in the bathtub. The killer was never caught." All day after the incident, Michael could not get the horrible story of the screaming in the next room out of his mind. He walked around the unfamiliar provincial town, entering the local pharmacies and offering his wares, but he did everything mechanically and absent-mindedly, almost thoughtlessly. His thoughts kept returning to what had happened that night. Who could have been screaming in the empty room? The ghost of a murdered woman? It was unpleasant to think about. In the evening, when all the business in town was done, Michael decided to leave the creepy place as soon as possible. He hurried out of town without even stopping by the motel to pick up his things. As he drove away, he breathed a sigh of relief, but the sound of the scream still rang in his ears, making him jump at every rustle and look around in the darkness. It was a night he would remember for a long time. It was February. I was sitting in an old leather chair in the middle of the dark living room of my decades-old mansion. The wind howled outside the window, rippling the bare black branches of the trees. It was dusk in the room, barely broken by the faint flicker of a crackling kerosene lamp with soot-darkened glass. I was reading a detective story about a series of gruesome murders. A shadow flickers outside the window, and branches slap the glass like someone's bony fingers. I shuddered and wrapped myself tighter in the warm blanket. Suddenly, from the basement, I heard a chilling scraping sound, like sharp claws scratching on stone. I looked up, out of breath, and listened as the sound repeated and grew louder. It was as if someone or something was clawing at the walls down there. I swallowed hard and slowly reached for the flashlight on the table. Clutching it to my chest with a trembling hand, I rose from the chair and tiptoed down the creaky wooden stairs to the basement, which was shrouded in impenetrable darkness. A ray of light caught the damp stone vaults in the darkness, streaked with mildew and thick cobwebs. Suddenly, this nightmarish sound came from around the corner. I nearly fell over in surprise. My heart was pounding in my throat and my legs were shaking. I looked around the corner and saw an old rusty metal door, and from behind it came a bleak howl that made my blood run cold. With a trembling hand, I reached for the rusty, creaking doorknob covered with dark stains, but suddenly the door swung open, almost hitting me. It smelled damp and rotten. I felt the icy breath of the tomb. And then I felt bony, scabby fingers digging into my shoulder with a deadening grip, digging into my flesh. I screamed and ran in terror, stumbling down the stairs. I ran upstairs in a panic, but there, in the doorway of the living room, a tall figure in black and white nun's robes was waiting for me. There was no emotion on her lowered face, but her bright yellow eyes were staring straight at me. In utter confusion and horror, I backed away, but bumped into something and fell onto my back. The terrifying silhouette, without moving, began to slowly float toward me. The closer it got to me, the clearer I saw the creepy smile on its face. I crawled backwards in terror until my back was against the door. As it approached me, the creature began to make a guttural mooing sound. In desperation, I grabbed the doorknob and yanked at the door, which fortunately gave way. I quickly slipped through the narrow opening and slammed the door in front of the monster's long nose. It howled and clawed at the door, trying to get at me. I pushed hard against the door as the creature thrashed and squealed on the other side. It was several minutes before the howling stopped and the pressure on the door eased. I slumped to the floor, almost unconscious from the horror of the experience. When I had recovered a little from the horror, I carefully opened the door. Slowly, I walked around the room, making sure the creature was not there. And then I cautiously left the house and hurried away, stumbling and looking around at every rustle. I managed to get to town, where I told the sheriff what had happened. Of course, when he sent men to search the house, they found no one there. They thought my story was the ravings of a madman. But I know what I saw that terrible night. This story is about a girl, Catherine, who was left home alone. It happened in a small town in Maine. That day, her parents went on a business trip for a few days. In the evening, after gathering the necessary documents and things, they said goodbye to their daughter and went on their way. Catherine waved as the car drove away and returned to the house. She was not afraid to stay at home alone because she was already 16 years old. Besides, it was not the first time her parents were away on a business trip, and they often called their daughter from afar. Catherine decided to spend her time watching the show and eating pizza. After taking the order from the courier, she settled into the chair and lost track of time. A few hours later, yawning and stretching, the girl looked at the clock. It was midnight. Putting away the pizza box and closing her laptop, she began to get ready for bed. After showering and brushing her teeth, she headed for her bedroom, walking through the small hallway between the bathroom and her room. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the window. Catherine shuddered in surprise and slowly pulled back the curtain. There was no one outside the window, only bare tree branches swaying in the strong autumn wind. The girl was sure she had not imagined it. After looking through the windows on both sides of the house and finding no one, she calmed down a bit and went to her room. However, she was interrupted by the ringing of the landline. No one could be calling her house this late at night, so Catherine decided not to answer it. That way, the person on the other end of the line should realize that no one is home, she thought. But a minute passed, and the phone still rang throughout the house, as if someone was waiting for Catherine to pick it up. Gathering all her will into a fist, she went to the phone, picked it up, and put it down immediately. The house fell into a sepulchral silence. The only sounds were the girl's heavy breathing and the beating of her heart. After about 5 seconds, the phone rang again, but this time the sound was much louder. It sounded as if the machine would explode if no one answered. Confused and angry, Catherine abruptly picked up the phone, hoping deep down that it was just someone's stupid prank. "Hello!" she shouted, but there was no answer on the other end of the line, only the hoarse and deep breathing of a man. The girl was speechless, goosebumps running up and down her skin. She hung up the phone and was about to find a cell phone to call her parents when the doorbell suddenly rang. Her heart sank into her heels. Trying not to make a sound, Catherine cautiously approached the door and peeked through the peephole. There was no one at the door. After waiting at the door for a few more minutes, listening for any sound, she calmed down a bit and was about to go to her room when she suddenly felt a cold breeze coming from the living room. Cautiously, she looked into the room and saw the window ajar, with muddy boot prints underneath. Frost ran down her skin. From that moment on, Catherine was no longer alone in the house. The realization took her breath away. What was she going to do? What should she do? Her instinct for self-preservation told her to run from the house, but then she heard the creaking of floorboards on the second floor. Catherine's whole body shook. She was afraid to move and stood there like a stumbling block. Minutes passed, the silence of the house pressing against her temples. The girl began to doubt that she had seen the footprints. And the creaking of the floorboards could be due to the difference in temperature, she thought, remembering a similar topic in school. But then the creaking resumed and the footsteps became a steady walk. The man was approaching the stairs. Realizing what was happening, she quickly hid behind the sofa and the curtain, putting her hand over her mouth to keep her breath from coming out. The footsteps grew louder until they stopped right in the living room. A moment later, there was a long scratching sound, like someone clawing at the furniture with sharp claws. Her heart, pounding furiously, almost stopped as Catherine tried not to give herself away. She had already mentally said goodbye to her family, and was prepared for any outcome when the man suddenly left the room in an unknown direction. Several hours seemed to pass before the girl looked out from around the corner of her makeshift shelter. There was no one in sight. Her eyes slid over to the couch, where a cut had appeared. After waiting a few more minutes and hearing no sound, she decided to leave the house and run to the neighbors. Catherine entered the hallway and started to put on her shoes when she heard a soft laugh. Dazed, she looked up to see a man standing at the front door, a knife glinting in his hand. The girl's life depended on her next actions. She had to save herself at all costs. Still holding a sneaker in her hands and aware of all the risks, she swung it at the criminal and ran down the stairs with all her might. He dodged and ran after her. Good physical preparation worked in her favor. The girl managed to run upstairs and lock herself in her room at the last moment. She grabbed her cell phone and hit speed dial. A beep sounded. At that moment, the stranger started banging on the door and shouting something. Fear and terror washed over her. Unable to reach her parents, she searched for something to defend herself with, but found nothing suitable. The anger of the man behind the door grew, and in a moment he started to kick the door in. "There are no options, we have to jump," Catherine decided, and opened the window. Climbing onto the windowsill, she heard the sound of the door being kicked in from behind and jumped down randomly. The landing was unfortunate, but fortunately a police car arrived. Apparently the neighbors, knowing that the girl's parents are not at home, heard the screams and immediately solved the problem. After catching the attacker, the investigator told Catherine and her parents that the attacker was wanted all over the country for a long time, and that the girl was lucky to be alive and unharmed. However, the psychological trauma still lingers today.